My guest at this time is Illinois Republican State Representative Tom Morrison. He joins me today to discuss the new abortion laws passed by the Democratic-controlled legislature and signed by Democratic Governor J.B. Pritzker. And Representative Morrison, thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks, Craig.
Well, as part of your outreach to constituents, you produce videos known as the Morrison Report, and in one of them, in conjunction with this debate, you speak with a gentleman named Ralph Rivera of Illinois Right to Life, who says this legislation, at least as initially proposed, is more expansive than what passed in New York State earlier this year and what was proposed in Virginia. So what exactly does this legislation do?
Well, the most important thing that it does is it says that abortion is a fundamental right of women. Actually, not just women. The sponsor of the bill said anyone with a uterus and ovaries. So I guess that's not just women today, as they would define it. But it expands abortion access. The age of viability definition is changed. The health provisions are very, very expanded, left up to interpretation. So there's a lot that this bill does, and the proponents were trying to argue that this is directly tied to Roe versus Wade being overturned. But really, 3 years ago, we passed legislation that would make abortion or would keep abortion legal in Illinois if Roe v. Wade was overturned. This bill was 126 pages long and expanded it. It removed clinic regulations. It removed provisions to have two doctors involved in a late-term abortion. And so there's a provision for non-physicians to do abortions up to a certain point. And so it was a pretty big expansion.
Let's talk about a couple of the issues you mentioned there. First of all, changing the definition of viability. How did that change?
Well, it's now left up to what the doctor determines at the moment, rather than having two doctors agree on a case-by-case basis. And so what we have seen in other cases, and, were they out of the ordinary? Maybe, but, there was a physician in Philadelphia, Dr. Kermit Gosnell, that was operating as one doctor and doing extremely late-term abortions in violation of state law, and so there was little oversight. And so we think that having a two-doctor provision is actually a protection for women. It's a protection for a viable child in the womb.
During the debate on the House floor, your Republican colleague Avery Bourne made an impassioned plea not to make it easier to terminate viable unborn children. It was an especially passionate issue for her because, at least at the time, she was pretty far along in her pregnancy. I don't know if she's already had the baby or not, but she also brought up a term that may be unfamiliar to a lot of people who follow this debate, and that's familial health being a factor that's considered in this legislation. What does familial health mean, and what does it mean in practicality?
Well, first of all, your listeners need to understand that when the definition of health is extremely broad, it could mean anything. It could mean financial health. It could mean mental health. It could mean, a mother doesn't like stretch marks, and so that would affect her perception of her body image and things like that. And so it's extremely broad. So familial health, again, it is totally up to interpretation. Maybe it's that a family already has a boy and they want a girl, and so they abort the child simply because the child isn't the sex that the couple wants or that the mother wants. Maybe it's that sleep would be interrupted by someone in the family, and so it is a very, very loose definition and totally up to interpretation. And so the emotional pleas of the proponents are that these are cases where the child is severely deformed, or the mother's life would absolutely be at risk, or there's something just severely wrong with this pregnancy. But that is not; those are not defined under this legislation. In fact, the opposite. You could have an abortion for any reason or no reason throughout the pregnancy.
So any reason or no reason at any time. One other issue that came up in this debate, Representative Morrison, was parental notification or consent for abortions for minors. You were telling me before we started recording that it's not technically in there, but you can see how it could be a slippery slope. Explain.
Right. Well, Illinois, about 20 years ago, passed a parental notification law for minors who were seeking an abortion. And that legislation was held up in the courts for almost 15 of those 20 years because there were rules that provided for a judicial bypass. In other words, if a teenager felt that notifying her parents put her at risk in some way, that a judge could grant the abortion without the parents being notified. Well, with this legislation that just was signed yesterday, if you make abortion a fundamental right, well, that statute then is in conflict with the current parental notification law. So we believe that the passage of this law yesterday in signature is going to create a court fight where proponents are going to try to undermine the state's parental notification law and say, well, this minor has a fundamental right to an abortion. Doesn't matter if she's 13 or 14 or 15. She has a fundamental right, and therefore the state's parental notification law has to go.
Another issue I saw in this, Representative Morrison, is that the state ban on partial birth abortions is essentially repealed as a result of this. The federal ban remains in place, but is that accurate that the state ban on partial birth abortions is gone now?
Yeah, well, I mean, there were several things that were, the proponents said, well, we're just codifying existing practice, or there were court injunctions. There was a court injunction against the state's sex selection abortion law. In other words, you could not do an abortion simply because you didn't like the sex of that child in the womb. And so this language just eliminated that. In addition to, the state had a partial birth abortion ban. It eliminates it. You're right. It still exists at the federal level, but there are workarounds. And as I understand it, if the abortionist just simply stops the heart of the child prior to delivery or prior to the abortion procedure, then any technique can be used. They just have to stop the heart first. So at whatever point that child is or the mother is in the pregnancy, they stop the heart first, and then they can use any technique that they want.
Speaking of the heart, the last thing I want to get your thoughts on here is the media coverage of this debate compared to the ones that we've seen in other states from a very different perspective. We've seen several more pro-life states pass legislation like the heartbeat bill, which would ban abortions once a fetal heartbeat is detected. But there's hardly been any national coverage. I'm not sure I've seen any for legislation that allows an abortion for virtually any reason at any stage of the pregnancy. What do you make of that?
Well, I think some of I don't read the New York Times, but I heard on the radio news that the New York Times did a comparison between Illinois and some of these other states, and actually that the action of other states might have been what pushed this legislation over the finish line. These two bills, there were two bills introduced early in the spring, January and February. One was essentially this bill that was signed into law. The second repealed the parental notification law. And voters, activists, citizens, and even some of the pro-choice lawmakers in the legislature were very hesitant to push those initial bills forward because they were so extreme. Because when you look at polling data or just the average person, what do you think about parental notification? What do you think about minors getting abortions without their parents being notified? What do you think about a late-term abortion for virtually any reason? Most voters would say, nah, we're not comfortable with that. Even some of the pro-choice legislators were reluctant to push those bills. And then as those southern states, as they moved forward on their bills and signed them into law, then the proponents in Illinois figured they had the green light to offer a counter to what was happening in those other states. And one of our neighbors, our state neighbors, Missouri, only has one open abortion clinic as it stands right now. And that clinic was threatened to close. And so the proponents just tried to take those other headlines and use that to fuel their own argument, even though those really were separate issues. I mean, Illinois already was a very abortion-friendly state. Illinois already did pass state funding of taxpayer abortions 3 years ago. we already passed trigger language that would keep abortion legal if Roe v. Wade was overturned. We already were friendly to abortion policy and abortion providers. In fact, Planned Parenthood decided to build 5 new clinics in Illinois just in the last 2 years. So we were already moving toward being a major abortion provider, and this just opened the gates even farther. I think to the detriment of women and certainly viable babies in the state. And then also you're going to see individuals from other states come to Illinois because the abortion laws are so lax. But I don't think that that is a healthy thing or a good thing for our state or for the Midwest.
Representative Morrison, thank you so much for helping us understand what happened in Illinois so much better. We greatly appreciate it.
Thank you.
Illinois Republican State Representative Tom Morrison. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.